So I was a postdoc in Vancouver at UBC in Canada, and before I'd left London where I graduated, the idea was I would go back to Queen Elizabeth College in London and set up a crystallography lab there. So 1 year into the postdoc, I got a letter from them saying that plans had changed completely. They were having a new building. There was a merger going on with parts of King's College in London. So sorry, there was no job. So I then started looking around for other opportunities, and I think the Kennard Group was advertising for a new postdoc at the time, so I applied, and the rest is sort of like history. But I shouldn't really have been here. I should have been at Queen Elizabeth College. I would say it was a typical crystallography lab of its time. So it was data collection, solving structures, particularly service structures for the chemistry department here in Cambridge. The big issues at the time were direct methods and how could you solve structures without, how could you solve the phase problem without recourse to heavy atoms in the molecule. And there were some exciting structures going through at the time. Adenosine triphosphate was going through, all sorts of natural products from various people in the department, and so on. But running parallel to that was the developing Cambridge Crystallographic Data Centre, if you like, which wasn't called that in those days, but the work to abstract crystal structures from the literature and to encode them on punch cards and electronic means was just about starting and getting off the ground. So I was particularly interested in that because as part of my PhD I had to do some extensive literature surveys, and because Imperial College where I was and Olga's group were closely linked, some of the computing actually in Olga's group was done at Imperial. So I was one of the few people who saw the developing bibliographic file, and it really helped to find all the references that I needed for my thesis. So I was already, in a way, when I arrived, I was already hooked on the idea of cataloguing the history of the subject. So it fitted, to my mind, really brilliantly with doing crystal structures as well. But certainly the first sort of 18 months, I think I was just doing crystal structures. It changed a lot in the 70s, actually. It was then that we had to start writing code for handling this growing body of data. And we also had to write code for evaluating and checking the data that was coming in. The data was being encoded directly from the literature, and therefore it was being typed, it had mistakes in it. So I became responsible in the mid-70s for writing the first sort of crystal structure evaluator. And then for my sins, I think I was the person responsible for checking out the first 5,000 structures that went into the numeric part of our database, which at that time was three separate files: a bibliographic file, a data file, and then a chemical connection table file. So the data side of it was very much was my bailiwick at the time. But following on from that, of course, there was then a push to write software for external users to search and use the data. And that had largely been in the hands of Sam Motherwell, but he left in 1978, came back later, but left in 78, and I then had to take on the responsibility for pushing that forward as well. So also in the late 70s, we started to do research based on the CSD. One of the reasons that really attracted me to the job in the first place was that we would build up this pool of information, and then it would be available to do original research with. And that again, in other people outside of Cambridge were actually doing some work of that sort, like Jack Dennett's and so on. And it became vital that we joined in with that research effort as well. So it was a mixture of doing crystal structures, programming, doing research, and a fair degree of organisation. So that's the way it sort of changed. And of course, the number of staff had to increase. One of the first things we had to do is to work out ways of disseminating the material that we were collecting. And one of the first ways of doing that was to disseminate the bibliographic information that I'd used so much in my PhD. And this was done by, I think, probably one of the first computer typeset series of books produced. They started at the very end of the 60s, I think. But I got involved in them again in the 70s and running right the way through to the mid-80s. And these books developed from just merely a bibliographic listing to containing chemical structural diagrams as well. And they were also extensively indexed so that people could use them in a reasonably efficient manner. So that series, I think, probably had 16 volumes in it that ran from about 69 to 84 or 85. Before other methods of disseminating the database took over, which was basically sending out the database to customers, initially academic customers, right the way across the world. And once that had taken hold, then the books became, in a sense, redundant. But it was an interesting phase of our development. I can well remember that we caused a certain stir in some of the print shops that we used, because the print unions at the time weren't too wonderfully happy about computer-based typesetting. And I remember walking through CUP print shop with a magnetic tape under my arm and the whole place just stopping work, staring at me. It was a very odd experience. There were two major issues in the 80s. The first one was to, as I said, we had three different files: bibliographic, connectivity, and data. What the big issue was to bring this together so we could have a coherent search system that covered all three aspects of the data. And so the 80s, a lot of the time was spent producing a unified file structure, which interestingly has lasted until the present day. It's just about being replaced now, so it must have been of some good technologically. So that file structure was developed, and then the whole of the search system then had to be rewritten to make best use of having the data in one single place. So that was what was really the key issue here in terms of the database. The key issue externally was disseminating it, and you'll realise that in the early days we were disseminating on huge magnetic tapes, 2,400-foot magnetic tapes, and releases were developing to be 4 or 5 or 6 tapes to each national centre. We used a series of national academic centres as nodes, if you like, for onward distribution to academic laboratories. And the skill was really, what we were doing there, was to package the database in separate programs. So the person at the other end had to do a considerable amount of work to turn it into a viable research system for their own labs. And of course, the technological developments since the mid-80s have meant that has become an easier and easier process, beginning with the VAX computers in the late 80s, early 90s. But now we just release complete systems, which you just plug in and go. But certainly when we were beginning to disseminate in the early to mid-80s, it was a very difficult process, both for us and indeed for the end user. But I think because the data was so valuable, seemed to be so useful, the end users persevered. So those were two aspects. A third aspect was building up a customer base, of course. And initially, our first customers academically were the USA and Italy, followed rapidly by Japan. And through the early 80s, the number of countries increased quite dramatically on the academic side. As soon as we were able to release half-sensible systems, if you like, on VAXs, then chemical industry became very interested, because here was a pool of data that they could use in rational drug discovery and so on. And from the mid-80s, I would say from about 86 onwards, we were increasingly releasing as well to industrial customers. So those three strands, but don't forget behind all that, we were still doing the occasional crystal structure, and research was going on as well. So it was more or less all hands to the pump, and everybody had to be multi-talented.